In 2018, the scientific world found its new villain. He Jiankui, the researcher who crossed the ultimate ethical line by creating the world's first gene-edited babies, was universally condemned and jailed for 3 years and forever branded China's Dr. Frankenstein. The expectation was simple. A scientist who commits such a profound transgression must be permanently banished, silenced, and forced into obscurity. That is the standard punishment for scientific heresy. But recently, the reality of He Jiankui's life post-prison has emerged, and its dramatic, unsettling reversal of that expectation. He is not in hiding. He's not silenced. Instead, he resides in a spacious Beijing apartment provided by an anonymous sponsor, complete with a bodyguard. He is operating out of a government-supported research center, openly boasting about his work and receiving job offers from state-funded medical institutes. When asked about the infamous Frankenstein nickname, the man who was supposed to be a pariah now smiles. He says he likes it because it proves he has superpowers. This is the core contradiction. Why is a nation known for strict control allowing its most infamous scientific criminal to not only walk free, but thrive? The answer, according to those who know him, is that in China's relentless pursuit of biotech dominance, He Jiankui is no longer seen as a liability. He is now viewed as a potential asset. And that shift changes everything we thought we knew about the future of gene editing.
You know, that phrase right at the end, potential asset, it does so much work. It completely flips the entire narrative we've been telling ourselves in the West for, the last 5 or 6 years?
Exactly. The story was supposed to be over. He broke the ultimate taboo. He went to jail. End of story.
Right. We all assumed that because he embarrassed the state, and make no mistake, he embarrassed them deeply on the world stage in 2018, that he was finished, that he'd be an academic ghost. But the fact that he is back, and not just back, but, funded and supported, it suggests the entire calculation has changed in Beijing.
It's a massive shift. And honestly, it's a little unsettling. I mean, the superpower comment, that he likes being called Dr. Frankenstein, that is not the statement of a remorseful man who spent 3 years in prison thinking about what he did. That's a flex.
It is absolutely a flex. It's a signal. And I think what we really need to try and figure out today is, who is that signal for? Is he sending a message to the West? Is it for the domestic audience in China? Or is it, and this is the chilling part, a signal to other scientists in China that maybe, just maybe, the guardrails are coming off?
That's the core question. And that is really the mission of this deep dive today. We're going to peel back the layers of this story because, on the surface, it seems like a biography of one rogue scientist making a kind of shocking comeback.
A comeback story.
Right. But when you actually start to dig into the sources we've pulled together, and we have a really serious stack of them today, you realize this isn't about one man at all. This is a case study. It's a case study of a massive state-sponsored pivot where biology is colliding with industrial policy.
We're looking at a system, a machine, really. A machine that is being deliberately designed to take all of the friction out of science to accelerate it. We're talking about this fundamental transition where China is positioning gene editing and synthetic biology, not just as medical research, but as the next trillion-dollar industry.
And to help us navigate all this, we're leaning on some really heavy-hitting analysis.
Sure.
We've got reports from the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, which are always eye-opening. We have deep dives from the Special Competitive Studies Project, or SCSP. And we have some incredible investigative reporting from places like the Age of Times, looking into He Jiankui's actual current status.
So the goal, really, is to understand the systemic machinery that lets a figure like He Jiankui return, not as a pariah, but almost as a symbol of a new era.
Exactly. We need to explore how China is trying to do to DNA what they just did to the electric vehicle market.
That comparison to EVs is so critical. I really want to emphasize that. It's not just a clever metaphor. It's the literal industrial blueprint they seem to be using. But before we get into the factories and the economics, we have to understand the environment, the ecosystem that even makes this possible. We have to talk about state capacity.
Right. Because you don't just wake up one morning and decide you're going to industrialize the human genome. It doesn't work that way. You need an ecosystem that supports that ambition. And to really set the scene for this, I want to read you this story I found. It's about a bioengineer named Lin, and it just perfectly captures the atmosphere in Beijing right now. I heard about a young bioengineer named Lin who recently moved his entire life from a comfortable laboratory in Boston to a sleek, state-of-the-art facility in Beijing's northern suburbs. In the West, Lin felt like he was constantly wading through a swamp of paperwork and cautionary pauses. But in Beijing, he described a sensation of being strapped to a rocket. I saw a clip of him walking through his new lab, It wasn't just the high-end sequencers that stood out, but the sheer lack of friction. The Chinese state hadn't just given him a job, they had built an entire ecosystem, a national power pillar, where the distance between a theoretical edit and a physical trial is shortened by a government that views biotech as a race for survival. Imagine the intensity of a workspace where the strategic state capacity isn't a dry policy term, but a literal green light that stays on 24/7. Watching this, I can't help but feel a mix of awe and a bit of a chill. From my perspective as someone who tracks these shifts, it's clear that China is treating the human genome like a new frontier of sovereignty. While we in the West are often locked in necessary but slow debates over the how and should, the infrastructure I'm seeing in places like Beijing is designed for the must. It's a transition from seeing science as a quest for knowledge to seeing it as the ultimate utility of a superpower.
Strapped to a rocket. That is such a vivid image. And I think for a lot of people outside of science or R&D, it might be hard to understand why that's so incredibly appealing. But if you are a researcher like Lin, if you've spent your entire career fighting for grants, filling out compliance forms, waiting for institutional review boards, the idea of a lack of friction is, well, it's intoxicating.
But isn't that friction there for a good reason? I mean, we're talking about editing genes here. We're not talking about a new app. These are things that can have irreversible consequences for generations. The swamp of paperwork that Lin is complaining about, isn't that just safety? Isn't that the whole point?
In the Western context, yes. Absolutely. We view friction as a safety feature. It's the brakes on the car. It's the guardrail on the highway. It's there to ensure we don't accidentally drive off a cliff. But the sources we're looking at, especially the analysis from Asia Times on what they call the accelerationist state, suggests that China has fundamentally reclassified what friction is. They don't see it as the safety feature anymore. They see it as a bug. They see it as inefficiency holding them back.
So they're basically choosing speed over safety. Is that the trade-off?
They would say they're optimizing for acceleration by design. That's the term the policy analysts are using. And to really get why, you have to look at where they're coming from. Think back about 15, maybe 20 years ago. In the pharmaceutical world, we had this phenomenon called the drug lag.
Right, I remember reading about this. That was the delay, right? The time between a drug getting approved by the FDA in the US or in Europe and when it finally reached patients in China.
Exactly. And it wasn't a small delay. We're talking 5, sometimes 7 years. Imagine that. A life-saving cancer drug gets invented in the West, the FDA approves it, and then China waits. They would wait to import it. They'd wait to re-verify the trials with their own data. It was a completely passive system. The history of pharma was essentially a monologue spoken by the West, and the East was just listening.
That has to be incredibly frustrating for a country with ambitions of being a superpower. To be totally reliant on your main rival for your nation's medicine cabinet.
It's more than frustrating. It's a strategic vulnerability, a massive one. So they decided to kill the drug lag. But here's the key. They didn't just want to catch up. They wanted to flip the entire script. And the main mechanism they used, and this is detailed in the regulatory reports, is something called the 60-day silent approval.
Silent approval. That sounds a little ominous. What does that mean in practice?
It's a brilliant, if definitely risky piece of behavioral economics. So in the US and historically in China, drug regulation is what you'd call an opt-in system. You submit your application for a clinical trial, an IND or investigational new drug application, and then you stop. You wait. You wait for a regulator to physically open the file, read it, stamp it, and give you explicit permission. Yes, you may proceed.
So the default answer is no, until someone in an office somewhere says yes.
Precisely. And if that regulator is understaffed or overly cautious or just having a slow month, you wait. You burn money, you lose momentum. But China flipped the polarity of that whole system. For these critical clinical trial applications, the system is now opt-out. You submit your file. A 60-day clock starts ticking. If the regulator does not issue a specific documented objection within those 60 days...
You just go. You just start the trial.
You just go. Inaction by the state results in approval, not delay. The default is now yes.
Wait, hold on a second. That seems unbelievably risky. You're telling me that if a file gets lost in a stack of papers or a bureaucrat is on vacation and doesn't get to it in time, a potentially dangerous human trial could just automatically start?
In theory, yes. That is the implication. Now, the Chinese regulators would argue that they have very rigorous triage systems and AI tools to immediately flag the highest risk applications. But you are putting your finger on the absolute core trade-off. They have shifted the burden of risk. In the Western system, the risk falls on the innovator, the risk of time, the risk of burning through cash while you wait in limbo. Right.
In this acceleration by design model, the risk is socialized. The system as a whole accepts a higher baseline of potential danger in exchange for a massive increase in speed and certainty.
It puts a ticking clock on the government, not on the scientist.
That's it exactly. And if you're an investor or you're a biotech startup or a researcher like Lynn, that certainty is unbelievably valuable. You know that in 60 days, you are either in the clinic or you have a clear rejection with reasons. There is no limbo. And suddenly, innovation is no longer a high-risk, low-return activity. It's commercially protected and strategically rewarded by the state.
So Lin isn't just imagining that he's on a rocket. The government literally built the launch pad and lit the fuse. But the story also mentioned the lab itself, the tech. He talked about high-end sequencers and the importance of data. It's not just about pushing paper faster, is it?
No, not at all. The regulatory shift is just the software update. The hardware is just as, if not more, important. And this is where we get into a concept that I find just absolutely fascinating. AI as sovereign infrastructure. Sovereign infrastructure, that's a term we usually use for things like ports or the power grid or maybe nuclear missile silos. You're saying AI fits in that category now?
In the context of modern drug discovery, AI is the infrastructure. You have to understand, modern biology isn't just about someone in a lab coat with test tubes anymore. It's fundamentally a data science problem. You are simulating billions, literally billions, of molecular interactions to find one promising drug candidate. And the sources point to a critical document that came out from the CDE, that's China's Center for Drug Evaluation, back in 2022. It's called the Technical Guidelines for the Use of AI in Drug R&D.
Okay, so 2022, that's very recent. What's the real significance of that document?
It directly addresses the biggest bottleneck in the West for adopting AI in medicine, the black box problem.
Right. Explainability. We have these incredible, powerful AI models that can look at a disease and predict a great drug molecule, but we don't always know why the AI chose that specific molecule over a million others. And our regulators, like the FDA, understandably say, if you can't explain how it works, we can't approve it.
And that's a perfectly valid scientific and safety concern. How can you trust a prediction if you can't trace its logic? It makes sense. But China looked at that bottleneck and essentially say, we cannot afford to wait for perfect explainability to arrive. So these guidelines, they basically provide the binding rules, the official framework for using AI-generated data in those IND submissions, even if the black box isn't fully transparent. They created a regulatory standard for accepting the output.
So they basically standardized the unknown so they could start using it.
Precisely. They built a bridge over the chasm of uncertainty that we're still trying to fill in, and they are backing that regulatory framework up with a physical infrastructure stack that, frankly, dwarfs what we have in the West. Just compare the data landscapes. In the United States, we have IPA, we have thousands of fragmented competing hospital systems.
Oh, don't even get me started. My dentist can't even email my x-rays to my orthodontist without a signed form. I have to physically carry them on a USB drive like it's 2005.
Exactly. We have data silos everywhere. It's designed to preserve individual privacy, which is important, but it absolutely kills the possibility of doing large-scale AI training. Now, look at what China is building. They have the full stack. They have petaflop-scale supercomputing hubs in places like Hong Kong and Shanghai, just raw, massive computing power. But more importantly, they have the National Medical Data Center.
Centralized data.
Centralized, aggregated, anonymized medical data from a population of 1.4 billion people. And they've built data export safe harbors that create a legal and technical pipeline to feed this national data directly into these AI models for training.
So if I'm an AI drug discovery company in the US, I'm spending months just trying to scrape together fragmented data sets from maybe 3 different university hospitals, and I have to get lawyers involved. In China, the state basically hands you the keys to the National Medical Library.
That is the ecosystem that Lynn was talking about. It's a competitive advantage that is incredibly hard to overstate. And it's not just happening in the cloud, in the digital realm. It's happening in very specific physical locations. The sources talk at length about these biotech hubs, places like Zhongguancun Life Science Park in Beijing, or the Zhongjiang High Tech Park in Shanghai.
Zhongguancun, I've heard that called the Silicon Valley of China.
It is, but the underlying philosophy is very different. One of the sources, mapping China's biotech hubs, calls this the alchemy of these hubs. In the US, our innovation hubs like Boston or the Bay Area are usually university first. You know the model. MIT or Stanford does the groundbreaking basic research, a professor spins out a company, and then it grows organically from there.
The ivory tower slowly feeds the market.
Right. In China, the model is entrepreneurship over academia. The university provides the talent network, sure, but it's the state that provides the scaffolding for ruthless, rapid market competition. They use these massive state funds, things like the Changping Mother Fund or the Life Valley investments. We're talking billions of dollars to fuse the drug discovery phase with the digital production phase right from day one.
So they aren't funding 10 years of purely theoretical research and hoping a product comes out. They are funding the product from the very beginning.
They are funding the result. It's results-oriented science. And that brings us back to the big why. You don't build a machine this fast, this aggressive, and this tolerant of risk just to make a slightly better version of ibuprofen.
No. You build it to lead. You build it to dominate an entirely new industry.
Exactly. And this is where the story pivots from policy and infrastructure to pure industrial strategy, because they are applying a playbook that we have seen before with devastating effectiveness. They are trying to do to biology exactly what they did to the global automotive industry.
The EV Playbook. And honestly, this next story I found is what really hammered that connection home for me. It's one thing for us to talk about industrial policy in the abstract, but it's another thing entirely to hear it from someone who was on the inside. I recently came across an interview with a former executive from a major Chinese electric vehicle firm who had pivoted into the gene editing sector. He spoke with a cold, fascinating logic. DNA is just a more complex code than a battery management system. He described the current CRISPR landscape in China as being in its Tesla moment. Just as the Chinese government forced the world's hand by scaling EV production until it was a global standard, they're now applying that same industrial results-oriented blueprint to biotechnology. I've seen drone footage of these massive biofoundries, where the goal isn't just to cure one person, but to create a trillion-dollar industry that renders Western medical regulations obsolete through sheer scale. They aren't looking for a niche, they're looking for dominance. It's easy to look at this factory approach to life itself and feel a sense of unease. As a YouTuber covering global tech, I've seen this movie before with 5G and solar panels. If China manages to scale gene editing with the same efficiency they used to take over the car market, the global medical map will be redrawn overnight. We might find ourselves in a world where the most advanced treatments aren't found in London or New York, but are made in China, forcing the rest of the world to play by their rules or be left behind. DNA is just a more complex code than a battery management system. That line just... as someone who loves biology, it feels incredibly reductionist. A battery doesn't have a soul. A battery doesn't have ancestors or consciousness.
It is reductionist, absolutely. But it is also the kind of ruthless engineering logic that scales industries and builds empires. If you treat biology as a mystical art, you get artisans making bespoke cures for a few. If you treat it as code and engineering, you get factories. And that is exactly what they are building. The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission has a term for this. They call it the interlocking innovation flywheels.
Okay, let's unpack that. Interlocking flywheels. It sounds like something from an engine room. How does making an electric car help you edit a human gene? What's the connection?
It's all about the underlying capabilities. Think about what China had to master to completely dominate the EV race in just a few years. They didn't just need to learn how to make batteries. They needed to build world-class industrial robotics to assemble the cars at scale. They needed massive AI networks to manage the national power grids and process autonomous driving data.
Okay, so heavy automation, big data processing.
Exactly. Now, what does modern high-throughput biology need? If you want to test 10,000 different gene variants for a new kind of crop, or screen 1 million chemical compounds to find a new drug, you can't have a human being sitting there with a pipette. It's physically impossible. It's too slow. You need industrial robotics. You need AI to analyze the terabytes of data that come out.
So the robots and the AI that learned how to build cars are now being repurposed to move test tubes and analyze genomes.
That's the interlocking part. The capabilities transfer directly. It's smart manufacturing applied to living cells, and the economic playbook transfers too. The sources call it brute force economics.
Brute force? It doesn't sound very subtle. It sounds like they're just muscling their way into the market.
It is completely unsubtle. It involves massive state subsidies to lower costs, state-coordinated supply chains to ensure no bottlenecks, and aggressive protectionism to shield their domestic companies. It's the exact same strategy they used with solar panels. Do you remember back when solar was this niche, really expensive green technology?
Yeah, and then it felt like almost overnight, cheap, efficient panels were everywhere.
Because China flooded the global market. They scaled up production to such an insane degree that the cost per watt plummeted, and dozens of Western competitors who couldn't match that scale simply went bankrupt. The fear, and according to the sources, the explicit strategy, is to do the exact same thing with biomanufacturing.
But can you really flood the market with biology? It feels different. It's not a solar panel. You can't just stack cures for cancer in a warehouse.
You can if you own the means of production for the ingredients of those cures. That's the Tesla moment the executive was talking about. And we have some really stark numbers on this from the SCSP report, specifically regarding these biofoundries.
Biofoundries. Even the name sounds like heavy industry. It sounds like a steel mill, but for cells.
That is effectively what they are. Let's look at one key metric: fermentation capacity. This is, in simple terms, the ability to grow biological material at an industrial scale. Bacteria, yeast, algae, whatever you're using to produce a specific protein or a chemical for a drug. China currently holds 70% of the global fermentation capacity.
70%.
70.
Over 30 million tons of capacity.
And what about the U.S.?
The U.S. holds just 34%.
Wait a minute, 70 and 34 is over 100.
The datasets use slightly different definitions of global capacity, which accounts for some multinational facilities, but the ratio is the key takeaway. It's roughly a 2-to-1 advantage for China. The gap is absolutely massive.
So practically speaking, what does that gap mean? What's the real-world impact?
It means that if a brilliant U.S. startup in Cambridge, Massachusetts invents a new synthetic biology product, let's say it's a new protein for a groundbreaking drug, they can make a gram of it in their lab. But if they want to make a ton of it to actually sell to patients, they often have to go to a company in China to manufacture it, because the U.S. simply lacks the pilot scale and industrial scale facilities.
So we invent the recipe, but they own the global kitchen.
And increasingly, they are inventing the recipe too. This is what the reports call the patent flip. For the first time, China now holds approximately 49% of all global synthetic biology patents. The U.S. is trailing far behind at about 12.8%.
That is a staggering statistic. I think a lot of our listeners still have this old school, maybe 1990s image of China as the copycat nation, that they make the knockoff handbags while we invent the iPhones.
That era is over. It's dead. They have very clearly moved from copycat generics to first-in-class innovation.
Can we look at a specific example of this in action? I want to see how the money and the policy actually flow to create one of these companies.
Sure. The sources consistently highlight a company called 3S Bio as a prime case study of what they call the innovation chain.
3S Bio. Okay, so how do they grow so fast?
It starts with the government guidance funds, or GGFs. This is basically the state acting as a venture capitalist. But unlike a Silicon Valley VC firm that needs a 10x return in 7 years to satisfy its investors,
The state can afford to be patient. They can play the long game.
the state is extremely patient, and it controls the entire board. They support the whole chain, so the government provides the initial research grant to the scientist. Then they provide the cheap land and fast-tracked permits for the factory. That's the brute force economics part. And then, and this is the most critical piece, they provide the guaranteed market.
They buy the drugs themselves.
The state-owned hospital system becomes the primary customer for the drug, so the company doesn't have to worry about marketing or finding customers in the same way a Western company does. The entire loop is closed by the state. It creates a buyer's market for innovation, where the government is the ultimate customer.
And is the quality there? Or are they just producing cheap, state-subsidized products?
The quality is absolutely there now. It's so high that we are seeing this historic reversal of the traditional flow of innovation. Multinational pharmaceutical companies, the big Western giants, are now actively licensing intellectual property from Chinese biotech firms.
So a company like Pfizer or Merck in the U.S. is paying a Chinese company for the rights to use their technology.
Yes, it's a massive tectonic pivot from just 20 years ago. The innovation is now flowing west. And this brings us right back to that sense of unease you felt in that opening story. If the most advanced treatments, the most efficient cures are made in China, using a system that prizes speed and scale above all else, what does that do to our understanding of ethics?
Right, because you can standardize a battery, you can scale up a solar panel factory, but when you apply that same ruthless factory mindset to human biology, to gene editing, you run headfirst into these incredibly deep moral questions. And that brings us to the third and maybe most complex part of this puzzle, the cultural piece.
The cultural calculation.
Exactly, because when we in the West look at He Jiankui, we see a monster. We see Dr. Frankenstein. But clearly the Chinese state, and it seems a significant portion of the Chinese people, are starting to see something very different. And I found a story that really challenges our Western perspective on this whole debate. Imagine a father in a second-tier city like Wuhan, holding his son who's been diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, a death sentence in slow motion. I read a heart-wrenching thread online where parents like him were discussing He Jiankui's return. To them, the procedural ethics debated in Swiss or American boardrooms feel like a luxury they cannot afford. This father didn't care about the slippery slope or international sanctions. He saw a collective survival strategy. In his eyes, in the eyes of many in his community, the risk of a rogue experiment is far lower than the 100% certainty of his son's decline. They view China's aggressive push into genetic research not as an ethical overreach, but as a form of civilizational resilience, a way to ensure the next generation isn't just healthy, but optimized for a harsh future. When I read stories like this, I have to step back and check my own biases. It's easy to sit in the studio and talk about the sanctity of the human germline, but it's much harder to argue with a parent who sees a gene editing lab as their only lighthouse in a storm. While we must remain vigilant about the ethical guardrails that protect our humanity, we also have to understand that for a large part of the world, health outcomes are the only ethics that truly matter. It's a powerful, pragmatic, and deeply human motivation that is fueling China's rise as a biotech titan, whether we are ready for it or not.
Procedural ethics as a luxury. That is a haunting phrase, but it explains so much of the fundamental disconnect between the East and West on this entire issue.
It really does, and it connects directly back to what He Jiankui is doing right now. He's not just doing random research. He isn't editing embryos for curiosity's sake anymore. He's explicitly focused his new lab on curing Duchenne muscular dystrophy and Alzheimer's disease.
Which, he's very quick to point out, is inspired by his own mother's struggle with Alzheimer's.
Right. So he's targeting these diseases that are devastating, that are currently incurable, and that are universally feared across all cultures. It's a very strategic choice of targets. It makes it much harder to just dismiss him as a villain.
It does. And this is where that superpower branding he's adopted comes in. He has completely embraced the Dr. Frankenstein label because, in his view, and in the view of that father in Wuhan, what did Frankenstein have? He had the power to create life. He had the capability. Jiankui is basically saying to the world, call me a monster, fine, but I have the capability that others don't. I can save your son.
And you can see how that message would resonate, especially with families who have no other options.
It resonates deeply. The sources talk about this cultural difference as civilizational resilience versus procedural ethics. In the West, our bioethics is overwhelmingly process-focused. Did you get informed consent? Did you follow the review board protocols to the letter? We worry intensely about the slippery slope. If we cure DMD today, does that mean we're designing babies with blue eyes tomorrow?
Right. We're always worried about where it ends. We worry about the unforeseen consequences of playing God.
In China, the data suggests a much stronger public focus on tangible health outcomes and collective survival. If the end result is a healthy child, the process used to get there is seen as secondary. There is very high public support in China for disease-preventing genetic research. Now, it's important to make a distinction here. Jiankui and the government are careful to say they oppose designer babies for trivial things like IQ or height. They align themselves strictly with the health argument.
Which is the much smarter play, politically and publicly.
It's the play that aligns perfectly with the CCP's grand narrative of national rejuvenation.
We hear that term a lot in geopolitics, national rejuvenation. What does it actually mean in a biotech context?
It means restoring China to what it sees as its rightful place as a global leader after what's called the century of humiliation. And biotechnology is viewed as a core tool for that restoration. A healthy population makes a strong nation. A population free of debilitating genetic diseases is a stronger workforce, a stronger military, a stronger civilization. It's framed as a collective goal, not just a matter of individual rights.
So where does the government actually stand on He Jiankui himself? Because it feels so ambiguous. They jailed him in 2019. They condemned him on the world stage. But now they're letting him work in a government-backed research center. You can't have it both ways, can you?
Ambiguity is a powerful strategy. Look at the timeline. In 2019, the global backlash was enormous. China had to act to save face internationally, so he was jailed for illegal medical practice.
He embarrassed the state, so he had to be punished publicly.
Exactly. But now, fast forward to today, look at the new regulations that came out last September. They explicitly prohibit modifying human reproductive cells for the purpose of pregnancy.
Okay, so no more gene-edited babies being born. That's a clear red line.
For pregnancy, yes. But The language regarding research editing embryos in a petri dish that are never implanted is much, much vaguer. And Jiankui himself has interpreted this as signal of a gradual opening.
He's reading the political tea leaves.
He is. And notice the silence. The sources point out that the prominent Chinese scientists who were so loud in condemning him in 2019, the ones who called him crazy and a disgrace to science, they are now largely silent. When reporters from the New York Times reached out to them for comment on his return, they either didn't respond or declined to comment.
That silence speaks volumes. It suggests the political wind has shifted.
Yeah.
And they don't want to be caught on the wrong side of the new direction.
It suggests that acceleration is back on the menu. The government seems to have decided that the potential benefits of his work and the work of people like him now outweigh the reputational risk from 2018.
So we have the state capacity, the machine, we have the industrial playbook, the factories, and we have this underlying cultural calculus, the will. This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, because this isn't just happening inside China's borders, this is spilling over. This is a global game now.
The global board.
Right. And it starts with something the sources are calling the Health Silk Road.
This is a fascinating and slightly unnerving expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative. Most people think of Belt and Road as concrete and steel, China building ports in Africa, railways across Asia.
Infrastructure diplomacy.
But there is a biological layer to it now. The sources highlight BGI, which used to be called the Beijing Genomics Institute. They are going to Belt and Road partner countries and offering to build them state-of-the-art genetic sequencing labs and provide the technology.
So the pitch is, we'll build you a modern sequencing lab to help you manage your public health.
Exactly. We'll help you handle your next pandemic. We'll help you sequence your population's genome to find genetic markers for disease. But the exchange is crucial. It's soft power, yes. But it's also about access. Access to diverse genomic data.
Data, the new oil.
And in genomics, diversity is incredibly valuable. If you only have genomic data from white Europeans or Han Chinese, your drugs and therapies will be limited in their effectiveness. But if you have data from populations in Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, you can develop precision medicine that works for everyone on the planet.
And China is systematically scooping up that diverse data globally while the U.S. is. What are we doing to counter that?
The U.S. is trying to counter. The sources do mention the Birmingham Biotechnology Hub in the Deep South. The strategic goal there is to use the diverse ancestral genomic diaspora that already exists in the U.S., specifically in African-American populations, to build our own diverse biobanks.
To protect our own biodata sovereignty.
Exactly. It's a defensive move because the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission came to a very specific and frankly quite alarming conclusion. They call it a sobering conclusion.
Okay, lay it on us.
They assess that U.S. policymakers have a 3-year window.
3 years? That's nothing. That is a blink of an eye in terms of national policy.
A 3-year window to retain America's leadership in biotechnology.
And if we don't, what happens if we miss that window?
We risk ceding military and economic advantages, potentially permanently. The risk is that the flywheel effect we talked about reverses on us. If China dominates the profits from the global biopharma market, if they are the ones selling the cures for cancer and Alzheimer's to the world, they control the reinvestment capital.
They get all the money to fund the next crazy breakthrough.
Precisely. They fund the next generation of technology. And this is where the Department of Defense report comes in, because we aren't just talking about curing cancer anymore. We are talking about dual-use applications.
Military application.
The DoD report explicitly mentions the strategy of military-civil fusion. The PLA, the Chinese military, has a deep and stated interest in things like neurocognitive warfare.
Neurocognitive warfare. That sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi novel. What does that actually mean in the real world?
It could involve things like brain-computer interfaces, or BCI, using gene editing or other technologies to enhance a soldier's cognitive function, or even to exploit the cognitive weaknesses of an adversary.
So we're talking about the potential for enhanced soldiers. Pilots who can process information faster than a normal human being.
Or just soldiers who don't need to sleep for 3 days. Or have a natural resistance to altitude sickness or radiation. The point is, in this strategic context, gene editing isn't just healthcare. It's considered a core interest for national security and sovereignty.
And this all connects right back to that engineer, Lynn, in the lab at the beginning, doesn't it? The national power pillar, the government's sense of must.
It does. The acceleration isn't just to fill pharmacy shelves. It's to strengthen the nation in every conceivable way.
This has been A lot to process. We've gone from a single controversial scientist in a Beijing apartment all the way to a global struggle for the future of human evolution.
It's a massive, complex landscape, and it's moving incredibly fast.
So let's try to pull these threads together for a final thought. We started with He Jiankui, the villain who became a potential asset. And the reason why is that the machine needs people like him. The state capacity, the friction-free labs, the opt-out regulations, the centralized AI, it's all built for one thing: speed.
And that machine is running on an industrial playbook. They are doing to DNA what they did to electric vehicles, scaling it up in massive biofoundries, using brute force economics to capture the global market, and creating an innovation flywheel that just keeps feeding itself.
And then underneath all of that is this fundamentally different cultural calculus. A pragmatic willingness to prioritize collective resilience and tangible results over the procedural ethics that we value so much in the West.
Which leads us to the geopolitical reality we're facing now. A 3-year window, a global race for genomic data, and the looming potential for military application. We have moved from a world where the West innovates and the East manufactures to a world where China is designing the future of biology itself.
It's a heavy realization, and it really brings us back to that first image that started this whole thing, Dr. Frankenstein.
The ultimate warning.
We started this deep dive with the image of Dr. Frankenstein, a warning about the dangers of unchecked science. But perhaps the real story here isn't about a monster, but about a machine. A state-powered machine that has decided the risks of not editing the human future are greater than the risks of doing so. If the next breakthrough in human evolution, the cure for Alzheimer's or cancer or aging itself, comes from a lab in Beijing that plays by a different set of rules, the world will have to decide. Do we reject the cure because of the system that produced it, or do we accept that the definition of ethical science has just been rewritten by the winner of the race?